One of the really nice things that we've mentioned about React is how we get to essentially just write vanilla JavaScript, and React is taking care of a lot of stuff behind the scenes. Well, with the stuff that's going on behind the scenes, every single component that we create is actually going to go through a series of phases or milestones during its time being alive in your React application. Often this is analogous to a human being who is born, has life milestones, and dies. Similarly, every React component will undergo a series of events when it's being rendered and updated. Now, I've divided lifecycle methods into two parts because the React team has just recently deprecated or gotten rid of 3 of the original lifecycle methods that we're about to talk about. And instead of going through every single one of these individually, I'm actually mostly going to just talk about the ones that are the most important to you right now as you're learning React. And then as you continue to learn, you can play with some of these other ones as well. For a full reference, I'm going to post here a URL to a site that does a really good job explaining the lifecycle methods that were a part of React before version 16.3. Check out those changes that happened in 16.3. You can check out this website, which is the official blog of the React team. With that being said, let's start talking about the lifecycle methods that we're most likely or most commonly going to use. The first is one that you're actually already familiar with, and it's a little bit of a gray area because this is oftentimes not listed as a lifecycle method, but the render method right here is something that we've been using as we've talked about class-based components. And one analogy that I like to use is that it's like getting dressed for the day. Its job is to determine exactly what gets rendered to the screen, which in turn is how the component is displayed to the world. Now, the render method can be called many times. Anytime React determines that something changes, like state or props, which might affect how the component is supposed to display, React may run the render method once again. Similarly, you may have had days where you've decided to change your clothes and look a little bit different to the world based upon what you're about to do. So hopefully by now that one's pretty straightforward. The next lifecycle method that I want to talk about is called componentDidMount. And these lifecycle methods are defined just like other methods inside of your class here. So I might say componentDidMount. Camel case like this. ComponentDidMount is a lifecycle method that's essentially like saying you were just born. This component did just mount to the screen. The very first time the component shows up, React will run the componentDidMount method. Now, this method will only run once while the component is showing up on the screen. Things like a re-render, which changes the way that the component is displayed, does not rerun componentDidMount. And that's because the component doesn't actually unmount and remount. The most common use case for componentDidMount is to do things like an API call when you need to get data from some kind of external source. For example, maybe this component is actually a to-do list, and I need to get the list of to-dos from some kind of server or database before I'm able to accurately display my to-do list. As soon as the component finishes mounting, I can get the data I need to correctly display. We're going to see this in a future lesson, but just know that that's one of the most common use cases for componentDidMount. The next lifecycle method I want to talk about right now is called componentWillReceiveProps. componentWillReceiveProps is kind of like when someone gives you a gift. This component could be receiving props from a parent component, and every time this component is receiving props, it will run this componentWillReceiveProps method. And componentWillReceiveProps will not only run the very first time the component is mounted, but it will also run every single time a parent component decides to hand props to a child component. For example, if a parent component decides to change the props that it's passing down to this component, one thing we can do inside of componentWillReceiveProps is check to see if the new incoming props are even different at all from the existing props. Oftentimes we will then say if they are not different, just don't do anything. But if they are different, maybe I have some kind of calculation to run or state to set or something like that. To receive those new incoming props, componentWillReceiveProps receives a parameter called nextProps. And it's just a parameter, so you can call it whatever you want, but oftentimes we put nextProps. And sometimes you'll see something like an if statement that says if nextProps dot whatever property you're looking at does not equal the existing props, then do something important here. So there's some good use cases for componentWillReceiveProps. However, as I mentioned, this is actually one of the lifecycle methods that's going to be deprecated, or actually is deprecated, starting in 16.3. Until React 17 comes out, they've renamed this with all caps unsafe underscore componentWillReceiveProps. So if you really need to use this, you can still do so. But once React 17 comes out, this is going to be completely removed, and componentWillReceiveProps will no longer mean anything special. So just be aware of that. It's a good lifecycle method to understand if you're looking at legacy code, but going forward, this won't be a part of React anymore. Another cool lifecycle method is called shouldComponentUpdate. And in our person analogy, I like to think of this as making a decision as to whether you need to change your clothes or not. Behind the scenes, if React has any kind of question at all as to whether a component needs to re-render, it will always choose to re-render it just in case, without any logic specific to your application's needs behind that decision. I think I said in the past that sometimes React will re-render a component even if nothing about that component has changed. Well, that can become kind of an expensive or rather slow operation if you let that happen to every single component in a large application. shouldComponentUpdate gives us, the developer, a chance to optimize our app. We can implement some logic here that allows the component to determine whether or not it's important for it to even think about updating. To help make that decision, this is going to receive the incoming props and the incoming state, which we'll call next props and next state. And in the body of the function, we need to either return true if we do want it to update, or we can return false if we don't want it to. Returning false from should component update is what will make your application more performant, but you'll just want to make sure that you actually don't want this component to update. Otherwise, it could really introduce some weird and hard to debug bugs into your code. The last lifecycle method we'll talk about right now is componentWillUnmount. Just like in life, all good things come to an end, and your component will eventually unmount from the screen or disappear altogether from the screen. The main use case for componentWillUnmount is to do some kind of cleanup or tear down of anything that you've set up that could potentially lead to clutter in the DOM or in your application. One of the most common use cases for this is if you in componentDidMount set up like an event listener. For example, you wanted to run some code every time somebody scrolled on the screen. This would be a chance to remove the event listener. But that's just one example. In general, it's a place to tear down or clean up your code before your component disappears. I'm going to move this after that so that it's obvious it's just an example. And that's actually all the lifecycle methods we're going to cover in part 1 here. There are a number of other ones that are important to understand. But for now, they're more advanced than what we're planning on getting into in this course. And so I'd recommend, if you're interested in learning more about them, going up to this link up here. Now this link was written before 16.3 was announced. So also take a look at the second link here, which will talk about the 3 lifecycle methods that have been deprecated, as well as the 2 new lifecycle methods that are introduced in their place, which we're going to cover in the next lesson.